you've been good this year, you're going to need a Christmas stocking. My detailed tutorial shows you everything you need to know to make 4 variations on this classic design. I show you in detail everything you need to know to make all of the variations, and you can download the template for free at creativebobbin.com. It's available in 2 different sizes. You can just print it at home on a standard printer and tape the pieces together and trace off your pattern. These stockings are all made from the same template, but just using different finishes. So the different toes and heels, there's some quilting on here, and I've used trims and fur. So I'll show you one at a time how I've done each stocking. Firstly, I'm going to show you how to make the entire stocking in this design. So this has the heel and the toe and the cuff and the trims, and it's got a loop. It's got all the basics that you need to know. So I'll show you now step by step how I made this stocking. The first thing you need is your pattern. You can download this template for free from creativebobbin.com. There's a link at the top and in the description. You can either print this on your printer at home in a series of A4 or letter size paper and then stick them together, or you can get them done at local printers. This is what I did, but I find this paper really thick for putting pins through. So I tend to print it out and then trace it off on normal pattern paper. So basically for each piece on this, you just need to trace it off if that's what you're gonna do. So I've traced each of these off. So just looking at the pattern here, basically if you're making the stocking with the different coloured heel and toe, you're using this piece and then there's the toe and the heel, or if you're doing it plain, it's this piece here, or you might be doing a mixture with the heel and toe on the front and then just plain on the back. But all of these pieces are basically what you need, and this is for the cuff at the top. If you're doing a cuff where there's fur on one side and a plain fabric underneath, then I'll show you how to do that in a second. So that's the first thing to do, is just to trace off the pieces that you need. So for this first stocking, which is one of the more basic ones that I'm going to demonstrate, I am making a lining for it. And so I'm just going to cut 2 of the plain stockings out of the lining fabric, which is a basic white cotton. And then for my actual stocking, I've got this elf fabric, which I'm going to use for this main piece here. And then for the toe and the heel, I'm just going to cut 1 piece out for each in this dark red. And then the cuff at the top, it's just going to be all the same colour, which is this green. So I need to trace off all of these pieces and then get these bits of fabric cut out ready. When you're cutting out your stocking pieces, just make sure you think about which way you want it facing for which way it's hanging. So this one, I'm going to do the contrast heel and toe, and I want my stocking facing this way. So for this piece, I'm going to cut it going this way, and then for the back, I just need to make sure it's facing the opposite direction. I don't want to cut 2 out facing the same way because it's not going to work. So just have a think before you start cutting which way things are going to face. This is everything now that I need to cut out. So this is the back with my elves, and this is the front, and then the heel and the toe in the red to go with it, and then the cuff, which is going to be folded over. So I'm just going to cut all of that out, and I've traced it off with the seam allowance from the template, so this is nice and easy to cut out. And then once I've done that, I'm just going to take this one off here and cut out 2 lining pieces that are just plain like this. That's all my pieces now cut out, so it's nice to finally see how it looks with all these different colours on. So that's the lining, and these are all the bits for the actual stocking. So the first thing I'm going to do is do the heel and the toe, and if you're doing that on the back as well, then just do the same in reverse for the back. So the first thing I'm going to do is put a few little snips around here. It's got a 1 centimetre seam allowance, so you don't want to cut these any longer than about 1/2 centimetre. But by putting these here, it's going to make it a lot easier to attach the heel and the toe. So I'm going to do exactly the same on this piece here. Now that both of these have had the little snips put in, I'm going to attach them to the heels and the toes. So you want to position it where it's going to be, and then just flip that one over so that you've got the right sides together, and just put a pin there just to make sure nothing's moved out of place. So that is correct. And then what you want to do is at either end, you're going to end up with this little triangle at this end, and the distance from here to here is 1 centimetre because that's your seam allowance. And then you just need to pin all the way around. I'm going to ignore that pin for now. I didn't do that accurately. I just put that in to make sure that it's all facing the right way. So at this end, you don't have that little triangle. It just joins up on a line. So I'm now going to just put another pin in there, and then I'll take that original one out because that wasn't done properly. So this now can be eased on, and you can see as you go around that curve, it's quite a curve to go around. All of these little snips start opening up, and that just makes it fit perfectly. So just take your time working backwards and forwards until that's all on properly. And then to check it looks right, just flip it over, and it's going to look a little bit funny because of the pins. Once this one is pinned on, you just need to do exactly the same on the toe. And then all I need to do is just sew this on, making sure it all eases in gently. So I'm going to use the seam guide for my 1 centimetre seam allowance, and I'm just going to sew all the way around here, just taking my time to make sure both edges stay together and the edge of the seam is on that 1 centimetre guide. That's now sewn on and ready to iron. You might hear the iron in the background warming up. It makes a bit of a funny noise. So I'm going to press everything to this side here, because what I don't want is to see it through this white fabric. So I need to press it all to this side. This side is fine, but this side here is going to bunch up a little bit. So I'm just going to trim that a little bit shorter. Because it's cut on the curve, the outer edge of it is a bit bigger than where the stitch line is. So I'm just going to trim that off, and then when it presses, it's going to sit a lot flatter. So I'm going to do that on both the heel and the toe before I press it. That's now pressed nice and flat, so you can see how neat that looks. So if you're doing the same on the back, then just do exactly the same in reverse. Otherwise, your back will be plain like this, and you just need to put the right sides together and just sew all the way around the edge. So that's all pinned now and ready to go. So I'm just going to sew 1 centimetre from the edge all the way around, from the top edge around the stocking to the other top. I'm not sewing across the top here. So I'm just doing a couple of reverse stitches at the top, and then I literally just need to follow the 1 centimetre seam guide and just sew all the way around till I get to the top at the other side. Once that's sewn, you just want to trim that seam allowance a little bit shorter. You don't need to worry so much on this straight bit, but to be able to turn it around down here, especially where it curves in like this, just cut that nice and short, not too short that it's going to weaken that seam, but you want to take about half of it off. Like I say, you don't have to worry so much on the straight bits at the top, but just take about half off all the way around this foot. You could sew it with a smaller seam allowance, but it's always really fiddly, and if you've got a fabric that frays, it causes problems. So I always just find it's better just to sew it with a decent seam allowance and then just trim it off after you're done. And that's that all trimmed off. And now that's done, I'm going to turn it the right way round so I can see for the first time how my stocking is going to look. And I'm pretty pleased with how that looks like that. So what I need to do is I need to go all around the edge, and I need to iron this nice and flat there. And I'm just going to take my time going all the way around the foot, making sure all of this seam here sits nice and flat. And the easiest way to do it is to use a pin, just to put it into the seam and pull it out and then press it. So as I said, all I'm doing is I'm using the pin just to where the seam line is, pull that out to make sure nothing's tucked in. You have to excuse the sound of my iron, it really is noisy. And then you just want to make sure, if the underneath hasn't got the toe, that it's underneath, not on the top. And then just press that little bit, and then just move around. And it does take time to go all the way around, but if you want a really good finish, it's worth doing. And that's my stocking now nicely pressed. And then I need to just sew my lining together. So that's the two pieces together. I'm not using a pattern on it, so you don't have to worry about the right side of the print or anything. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to sew it slightly in from where I stitched it on the outer one, because this needs to sit inside here, so it needs to be slightly smaller. So if that's where my 1 centimetre would take me, I'm just going to go in by a couple of millimetres and sew in there. I need it to be the right amount at the top though. I need it to be exactly the same size as this at the top. So I'll start with my 1 centimetre and then I'll just come in very slightly to go all the way around. So I'm going to start off at the top here with the 1 centimetre, and I'll do that just for the first few centimetres, and then all I'm going to do is I'm going to bring it in slightly. So if I show you on here, that's 1 centimetre, that's 1.5 centimetres, this line there, and I'm just going to go in between the two. So I'm basically coming in 2.5 millimetres. So you should have a seam guide on your sewing machine. So I'm just going to do that all the way around, and then when you get back up to the other side, all you want to do is just gradually bring that out back to the 1 centimetre mark, a few centimetres before you get to the end, and then just a few reverse stitches, and that's the lining put together. So that's the lining all sewn up, and then I'm just going to trim this just like I did with the outer. It's not to turn it inside out, but it's just to have less bulk when it goes inside the stocking. So you don't have to line your stocking if you don't want to, but I always just think it gives it a much nicer finish, and if you're planning on using these stockings every year, it just makes it a little bit more robust. And now I just need to put the lining inside there. So you can see now with that trim down, that will fit in nicely. If you find when you put it in that it feels too bulky inside, then just go round again and just sew it to make it a little bit smaller, but that should fit in really well. Just however much you take it in, make sure you don't take it in at the top, because we need these two bits to be exactly the same size. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to line the seams up either side, make sure they are perfect. So I'm going to open that up there and line that seam up. And I'm going to do exactly the same on this side. And then I can just put some pins in between those. So the outer and the inner are joined together at the top. So all I need to do now is just stitch that around the top, and that's all joined together. And all I've got left to do is the cuff at the top. That's all now joined together. So the last bit is to do the cuff at the top. So I'm going to fold it this way, and I'm just going to sew it together down this side. So I'm just going to go and sew that up. That's sewn up and pressed flat, and then the next thing I'm going to do, I don't have a pattern so I don't have to worry what is up and what's down, but if you've got a pattern, just make sure you've got this facing the right way up. So I folded it in half with that seam on that side, and I'm just going to put a pin there, and that basically just shows me where the halfway point is. So I've turned this now the right way around, and then I'm going to put it inside my stocking. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put a pin through this seam here, and then the same pin goes through the seam on the stocking. And then I can just fix that on there with a pin. And then what I'm going to do is exactly the same on this side. I don't have a seam on this side, but I've put that pin in there that marks the halfway point. And then I'm just going to put it through there like that. So that's either side pinned on there. So you've got the right side of the cuff facing the lining of the stocking. And then I'm just going to pin all the way around with a few pins in between the ones that I've done. So that's all now pinned on and ready to sew. So I'm going to go and get that sewn together. So that's now sewn on 1 centimetre from the edge, and I'm not going to trim anything because that is going to allow us to fold it with a nice kind of ridge under here. So I folded that over so you can see the join here, and then it just folds around. So that's all the wrong side there, bringing it around there. And then I want to tuck this under 1 centimetre, which is our seam allowance. So I'm starting where the seam is, and then I'm going to line it up here with where I've just stitched it on. And then I'm just going to put a pin in there. And I'm basically going to just work all the way around, folding that under 1 centimetre, and then lining it up with that seam line, and then putting a pin in. So I'm just going to go all the way around till I get round to the other side, and you just need to make sure you do it nice and evenly. If when you get to the other side you either have too much of this one or too much of this one, just ease it on all the way round. That's all pinned on now all the way round and ready to sew. So this is the bit that's a little bit fiddly to do because you need to get your sewing machine kind of through there, and you need to bunch all of that up. So just take your time, or if you're not confident doing that, then you could always hand sew this around here. So what I'm going to do now all those pins are in is I'm going to swap them for pins going in this direction, because it just makes it a lot easier when I sew it. So I'm just going to do that all the way around. So as I said, this is the fiddliest bit to sew. So just take your time. Make sure you don't have the other side of the stocking under the foot accidentally. And all you want to do is just sew just inside the cuff fabric there, just so it stitches just through. You don't have to worry too much about this bit being perfect, because you don't actually see this once your cuff is turned over. So don't worry too much about it being absolutely perfect. So I'm not going to film going all the way around here because I have this tripod and camera in between me and the sewing machine. So it's not the easiest thing to do. So I'll show you that once I've sewn it all on. And that's now sewn on. You can just see that stitch line there. So where the seam allowance is on the inside is 1 centimetre, and that's basically the top of your stocking. So you just need to turn this the right way round, and you can feel the ridge of where that seam allowance is, and that's the top edge. So I've got this nice green velvet ribbon that I'm going to just sew on the edge here, and I'm also going to use a little bit to do a loop up here. So to sew this on, what I'm going to do, I'm going to make that nice and flat, and I'm just going to put some pins in here so I know that that is creased in the right position while it's like this, because when I open it up, the inside here is going to be slightly smaller than the outside, and depending how bulky your fabric is, it might shift a little bit, but I know now that that's in the right position. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to just stitch this on the edge, and I'm just going to start on one side and just sew all the way around until I get back to the beginning, and just stitch it on either side. That's all now sewn on, so that stocking is complete. The only last bit I'm going to do is I'm going to make a little hanging loop to go at the top so we can hang that up on Christmas Eve. So it's up to you how long you want to do your loop. You can use a trim like this if you're matching it to something on the stocking, or you can just make a bit of rouleau or a bit of tape out of the leftover fabrics. So I'm just going to cut that to size, and then all I need to do is just stitch this on the inside where that seam is there. You can do it as you're going along and put it into this seam, but it can just get a little bit bulky. So I prefer just to stitch it on afterwards. And if you've not made anything like this before, it just makes it that little bit easier. So just make sure when you stitch it on, you only go through this layer here. It all gets covered up. You just don't want to sew your cuff down. So hopefully you can see that really clearly. I'm literally just going to stitch it through just below where that cuff goes on, and I've made sure that nothing is caught underneath. You don't want this all caught underneath there. So that's all the steps you need to know to make the basic stocking shape, and now I'll just go through the variations of the other ones. This stocking is exactly the same as the first, but I've just used the same colour on all of the contrast pieces. And then when sewing the heel and the toe, before I joined the front and the back, I just sewed this little rickrack trim on. So it just adds that little bit more detail. And other than that, it's exactly the same. I couldn't resist putting a little furry trim on this one. So it's slightly different because it doesn't have the same fabric underneath. So I'll show you now how to make exactly the same stocking, but using 2 different fabrics for the cuff at the top, so that if you're using anything bulky like a fur or a fleece, it can sit much better at the top of your stocking. All you need to do is take the piece that you've traced off for the cuff and just fold it in half. So it's all got its seam allowance, but the folded edge won't have a seam allowance. So when you cut it out, you just need to add it on. You want the underside to sit nicely under the fur. So when you're cutting this out, just cut around these edges, but you need to add a seam allowance where the fold is. So you just need to add a slightly smaller seam allowance on the underside to what you do on the fur. So rather than 1 centimetre, I'm going to do 8mm on this cotton, and I'm going to do 12mm or 1.2 centimetres on the fur. So all I'm doing here is I'm just cutting it using the ruler to measure it 8mm across from the fold. And then on all the other sides, I can just cut it just around the pattern. Fur can get really messy when you're cutting it out. So you want the fluffy side underneath, and then you can cut through, it's normally knitted, you can cut through this knitted bit, and you can try and get your scissors, I'll show you on this side, you need to just try and get your scissors just through that bit without cutting through all the pile, because you're just going to end up with lots of fluff everywhere. So I'm just going to pin this pattern piece onto here, and then I'll start cutting that out. So I've got my seam allowance around here like on the last piece, so I just need to add it on this folded side. So this time I'm going to do 12mm, and I'm going to try as best as I can just to cut through the knitted bit. I'm just going to take my time. So I'll just get this cut all the way up this side, and then I can go around the other edges, just cutting it right next to where the paper is. So that's now everything cut out. So the cotton's going to go underneath and then the fur on top. So make sure if you've got quite an obvious pile that it's going down. You don't want that going up. And we're going to join this at the bottom here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the right sides together. And I always find it easier to do it with the fur on the top, because if not, you can't see the cut edge. So I'm going to pin that all the way across. And remember, we have a bigger seam allowance on the fur than we do on the underneath. So that's going to sit slightly short on that side. And that'll just help the cotton fabric or whatever you use to stay underneath. So I'll pin that all across there, and then we'll get that sewn together. I'm going to sew this with a walking foot, because when you're using something bulky like this, particularly if you're using something different against something bulky, it just helps everything stay in place. If you haven't got a walking foot, then the best thing you need to do is sew slowly and just use a pin to feed it in to make sure that nothing gets bunched up. So I've got this on a 3mm length stitch, and I'm going to just do a couple of reverse stitches to start with. And then I'm just going to sew along. So I'm just keeping this to the same 1cm seam allowance. Even though I've got the walking foot, I'm still going to push that in with a pin, because it just helps feed it all in. And the best thing you can do is just sew really slowly. Once you've got that sewn, it's a good idea just to check. It's easiest to check on the plain side that it's all stitched without all getting puckered up or anything like that. So that's all stitched on. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim the fur a little bit shorter. I'm not going to take loads off, but I'm just going to take a little bit off just to have as little bulk as possible. And then what I'm going to do to stitch this down to make sure it stays nice and flat when it's finished is I'm going to push both seam allowances to that side. And I'm just going to sew that down, and it will just help this sit a little bit flatter. So I've got exactly the same stitch length and everything, and I'm just going to sew down here, just catching this seam allowance here. I'm not going to do any reverse stitches this time. I don't really need to. And I'm just going to take my time sewing through that, and it helps it all stay in place. And just use a pin to feed it through. So you just need to make sure you don't cut that too short before you do it. You can cut it after you've sewn this bit, but it's just a bit easier to cut it first. And that's now sewn up. So you can see that sits nice and flat like that. And then once it's on the stocking, that bit will be underneath, and it just helps that stay in place. So now I just need to finish it off and put it on the actual stocking. So from this point on, it's just exactly the same process as with the basic stocking. So I'm just going to join these up. I've pinned this down the side here, so I'm just going to sew that up the same way as I did on the basic stocking. So all you need to do is just make sure that you've got where the join line is here, just make sure they line up. So I'm just going to go and stitch that. Once that's sewn up, that can now be turned the right way round to see how it looks, and that looks fine. So just make sure this all lines up. Now that I've got both pieces done, I just need to join them together. So I've got a seam line there that I can line up with. So on this side, I'm just going to put a pin to mark the fold there, and then to make it even easier, I'm going to line up where this pin is with that seam there, and then I'm going to put pins either side here, and that's basically the halfway points, and that's just going to make it a lot easier when I join it onto this. So on this bit here, I'm just going to line both of those seams up and put some pins at the sides where it folds. So I've now got a pin either side and in the middles, and I just need to attach this. So I'm going to find the part where my seam is, and you just need to decide on here which side you want your seam. It doesn't really matter, or you can do it at the back. You can put it wherever you want. I'm going to put it at the back on this one. And then what I need to do, so I've basically got the right side of the fur joining onto the lining of the stocking. So I'm going to put a pin through there and then through where that pin is on there. And that's that first point marked. And then I can take that original one out, and then I'll work my way around, and then this pin here goes through and goes through that seam on there. And I can switch it with one going that direction, and I just need to do that on all 4 of these, and then I can just pin in the gaps in between, ready to sew. So this is now all pinned on, so I'm now going to just sew that on using my walking foot and make sure nothing gets puckered up, but that is all ready to put on. That's now all sewn on, so let's turn that around and see how it looks. Obviously the cotton will be underneath, we just need to finish the last bits off, but that looks pretty cool. So now that's all done, the last bit is just to finish this off exactly the same way as the basic stocking. So I'm just going to fold that under and pin that so it joins with that stitch line, and do that all the way around. So you can either take your time and go around with the sewing machine and do this, or if you find it a bit easier with all this bulk, if you're not used to sewing fur, then you could just hand stitch this. But that's this stocking now completely finished once that's done. So that's all sewn on now, finished off with the machine. It was very fiddly, so I definitely recommend, if you're not used to doing this, hand sewing it. But that is now all done, and I absolutely love how that looks with the little furry trim. And then the last one is the same shape but without the heels and toes, because I did quilting on this one. It's hard to see in the video, but it's a little bit thicker, and by putting the heels and toes on, I thought there was going to be an awful lot going on. So I'll show you how you can do this basic quilting that you can then use your quilted fabric to make a lovely padded stocking. I'm just going to do some really basic quilting on this, just some diagonal lines. So I've got my main fabric, and then I've got a sheet of just really lightweight wadding, and then I've got some cotton muslin to go underneath. What I don't want to do is cut the shape out and then do it, because it's going to be a lot harder. It's much easier to do if it's a rectangle. And also, once you've got those quilting lines, it might make it slightly smaller. So if I cut it out once I've done the quilting, I know that it's exactly the right size. So to start with, I'm just going to put a bunch of pins in this just to hold all the layers together. The pattern on this one is so bold, you probably can't see the pins, but I've just put a few pins throughout. And then I just need to make sure that this is big enough. So I'm not putting the heel and the toe on this because there's going to be too much going on. So I just need to make sure that I do one with it facing that way and one with it facing that way. So let's start with this one facing this way. And I just need to basically make sure that that is big enough for that. And I've cut the excess off of the main fabric. So now with the rest of it, I just need to just cut the muslin off from the other bits that I don't need. So the first thing I need to do is decide on the angle. I like it going along into the toe. So I'm just going to put the ruler at the angle that I want it, and then I can take that out of the way. And then I'm going to use the chalk to draw the first line. So I don't know how well that shows up in the video, but that's my first line there. And then you need to just work out what spacing you want, really. If you've got one of these style rulers with the grid on, these work really well, but I'm not going to show you with that because I think there's so much pattern going on, you're not really going to see it. But it's great to be able to use one of these. If I hold it over there, you can see it better, to line up these lines. But if I show you using the metal ruler, all I need to do is make sure they're all parallel. So I'm just going to line that up with the previous one and draw my chalk line. And I'm just going to do that all the way along. So I'm not really sure how well you can see these chalk lines. I can see them reasonably well, but it's not that easy to see them because the pattern's so bold. And on the video, I'm guessing you probably can't see them very well at all. So what I'm going to do at this stage is I'm going to put pins all the way along the stitch lines through where the chalk is, because when I come to sew it, I think I'm going to struggle to see them. and the chalk also might rub off. So I'm just going to do that. You could do it with a basting stitch if you want to, if you feel happier doing that. But doing that with pins is enough. So I'm just going to redo all of these lines going through here. That's all now pinned and ready to start stitching. You probably can't see at all where these pins are. So if I turn it over, you can see now I've got all these rows that I'm going to stitch down. So now all I need to do is just replace all of these rows here where I've pinned it and chalked it with a stitch line. And just like with the fur, I'm using the walking foot because it just works a lot better. If you haven't got one, you can still do it, but if you have got one, then you should use it for doing this. So that's the first line done. I'm using the dark red because I thought it would go nice with this. So just do a couple of practice rows to get the colour you want and the stitch size. This is a 3mm stitch size. So now all I need to do is just work my way across and do all of those stitch lines, and then I'll do the second piece with them going in the opposite direction for the front of the stocking. And that's this first piece now done. It takes a little bit of time, but it's really nice once it's done. So I've now got my rectangle that I can cut this piece out of, and I'm just going to do exactly the same in reverse with the lines going that way for the piece that's going to go facing that direction. So I can just make this stocking exactly the same way as the others. It's just going to be a little bit thicker when sewing through here. That's the only difference. That's both pieces now cut out with all the quilting. And what I'm going to do, because this is all quite open here, I'm just going to sew all the way around, just a little bit from the edge, just to hold everything together before I put both of these pieces together. That's all now fixed around the edges, so you can see it's all held together nicely. So this is ready now just to put the right sides together, and then I can just sew around it and finish the rest of this off exactly the same way as the others. For this one, I'm going to make a little loop to hang it out of some of the scrap fabric. So all I've done is I've folded it on the right hand side, and I'm just going to stitch all the way down at the 1 centimetre seam guide. And now that that's done, I'm just going to cut the seam allowance fairly short. And then I'm going to use this rouleau turner to turn this the right way round. If you don't have one, you can use a safety pin to thread it through. I'd recommend getting one of these though, because they are really handy. So I've looped that through, and then I'm just going to pull this through. And there's my little ribbon for hanging it. It just needs a little press, and then I'll put that on in a second when I attach the cuff. So my quilted stocking is now pressed flat and it's ready to put the cuff on. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to attach the loop before I put the cuff on, just so you can see how to do it. So I've ironed that flat, and then I'm going to sew it onto this side here, because you would normally have it hanging from that side. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to sew this one on this side of the seam and this one on the other. So I'm just going to sew those on like that, and then when the cuff goes on, the loop is already attached on the inside. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and you're now feeling super festive to go and make your own stocking. Hopefully you've been good this year, so Santa is going to bring you lots of lovely presents to fill these stockings. If you've enjoyed this, then I'd recommend this video next, which would make a great homemade Christmas present.